Welcome to the Center for South Asia on Earth Day. I am Lalita du Perron. I'm the Associate Director in the Center. Thank you all for being here. I would like to start by acknowledging that Stanford sits on the ancestral and unceded land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to honor and make visible the university's relationship to indigenous peoples. I'd like to thank the Abbasi Program in Islamic Studies for co-sponsorship of today's events. We're going to have two speakers followed by Q&A. You can use the button at the bottom of your screen. You can enter your questions anytime, and we apologize in advance that we are unlikely to be able to get to all the questions. And now I will introduce today's moderator, Dr. Maira Hayat. She is a lecturer at Stanford Global Studies and is teaching classes on climate change and environmental politics. This fall, she will be joining the University of Notre Dame as an assistant professor of environment and peace studies. Maira, thank you for being here. It's all yours.
Lalita, for that introduction. Thank you, Lalita and Simrat, for helping to put together this event. Pakistan might seem a curious site from which to offer perspectives or provocations on environmental justice. In terms of gatekeeping concepts, environmental justice is certainly not on the list vis-a-vis Pakistan. As a friend said in response to my invitation to today's event, environmental justice, Pakistan. Environmental injustice might have been better. Pakistan, the world's fifth largest country by population, has been a poster child for violence, whether slow or spectacular, failure and dysfunction. One could ask, though, what sort of understanding of environmental justice it would be that did not think against an injustice or violence. Even after recognizing the class exclusivities of an environmental politics authored in and by the higher courts, that the country's courts have been active players in the articulation of environmental justice demands a deeper understanding, even reckoning. In a 2018 case at the Lahore High Court, the highest provincial court in Punjab, the petitioner claimed that inaction on the part of Pakistan's Ministry of Climate Change and other departments in not implementing a climate change framework offended his fundamental rights, in particular Articles 9 and 14, as well as constitutional principles of social and economic justice. So Article 9 is a right to life and Article 14 is a right to human dignity in Pakistan's constitution. The judgment termed climate change one of the greatest threats to human rights of our generation, constituting a serious risk to the fundamental rights to life, health, food, and an adequate standard of living. It continued, notwithstanding that Pakistan's contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions is very small, its role as a responsible member of the global community entails combating climate change. The judgment called climate change a defining challenge of our time, and on a legal and constitutional plane, a clarion call for the protection of the fundamental rights of Pakistan's citizens, in particular the vulnerable and weak who are unable to approach this court. Climate change had moved the debate from a linear local environmental issue to a more complex global problem. In this changed context in which the court recognized the identity of the polluter is not clearly ascertainable and by and large falls outside the national jurisdiction, the question arose, who is to be penalized and who is to be restrained? As the Lahore High Court navigated these complex questions of global relationality and accountability, the very same year, the country's Supreme Court issued an order initiating crowdfunding for 2 large dams. The Chief Justice at the time expressed the hope that, I quote, the passion that was seen during the 1965 war with India would be visible again for the construction of these dams. The order reasoned in a way that made the 2 dams the means to realizing the fundamental right to life promised in Pakistan's constitution. I quote, right to life is a fundamental right, and without water, there can be no existence of life. The establishment of water reservoirs is therefore not a question of just quality of life, rather the very existence thereof. Also that same year, the court summoned bottled water companies to probe the extraction of groundwater without any charges. That questions of environmental public interest are being addressed in Pakistan's apex courts has a long history. It is anchored in the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court provision, also known as a suo motu provision, contained in Article 184(3) of the Constitution, as well as specifically an environmental case law precedent. In one of the first cases in environmental jurisprudence, perhaps, in 1994, Shaila Zia versus Vapta, the Supreme Court ruled that in future, public hearings ought to be held by state bodies when planning projects such as an electricity grid station. Of course, the courts are not the only sites of environmental justice efforts. As we speak, efforts such as the Karachi Bachao Tehreek are underway, protesting the demolition of settlements deemed illegal. Petitions are being heard in Lahore's courts against a proposed riverfront development on the River Ravi. About 2 decades ago, the Okada military farms protests turned attention to questions of land ownership and oppressive tenurial regimes, the subject of one of our speakers' first books, actually. So to help us better understand this rich and contested political space, we are joined by 2 guests today. I'm absolutely delighted that they are here with us and very much look forward to learning from them. Ahmad Rafay Alam is an environment lawyer and co-founder of a law firm specializing in water, energy, natural resources, and urban infrastructure. Rafay also teaches water, climate change, business, and environmental law at the Lahore University of Management Sciences, the National Institute of Management, and the Lahore School of Economics. He is a lead course instructor on water law at the Panjwani Hisar Water Institute at the NED University, and advisor to Air Quality Asia as a member of the Hisar Foundation. Rafay was a 2014 Yale World Fellow. Mubbashir Rizvi is an assistant professor of anthropology at Georgetown University. He holds a PhD in social cultural anthropology from the University of Texas at Austin. His research and teaching interests include social movements, environmental justice, indigenous and peasant land rights, postcolonial militarization, race, and empire. His first book, The Ethics of Staying, Social Movements and Land Rights in Pakistan, published by Stanford University Press in 2019, is an urgent and compelling ethnography of military land ownership and its contestation by the Punjab Tenants Association, the Anjuman Mazareen Punjab in Pakistan. Welcome. Let us begin then with Rafay. We will then hear from Mubbashir. After that, we will have some time for audience questions. So please send us your questions in the Q&A box as the talks proceed. Rafay, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Maira. It is such a privilege to be able to speak on Earth Day with you all. My name is Rafay Alam. I'm an environmental lawyer in Pakistan. I'm based here in Lahore. And just a few nights ago, I had to call Maira up to ask her what environmental justice means. I'm an environmental lawyer. The first thing I said to her was that I've never seen environment and justice together, so I have no idea what this talk is going to be about. And that's the difficulty. There's so many things. We could talk about Okara, we could talk about Ravi, but I want to start, if I may, with climate change or the climate crisis, which is the most pressing issue from a point of view from humanity and civilization, and for Pakistan as well. I want to start with this reference, this talk I gave in 2018 to the Senate Standing Committee on Climate Change, where I had just come out of a presentation by Dr. Ghulam Rasool, Pakistan's former head of the Met Department, the Meteorological Department. He's now at ISIMOD, which is the International Climate Research Organization that SARC, the South Asian Regional Cooperation Association, has in Kathmandu. And Dr. Ghulam Rasool had given this presentation just before about how the Himalayan, Hindu Kush and Karakoram mountain ranges and their glaciers are going to be impacted by climate change. You can look it up. It's the ISIMOD Glacier Report of 2018. It's the most comprehensive report you're going to find of the climate impacts on what is essentially the third largest collection of fresh water on the face of the earth. And Ghulam Rasool does not report any good news. He said that if we can somehow miraculously keep temperatures to about 1.5 degrees to sort of industrial levels, which is the Paris Agreement ambition. Even if we can do that, we're looking at about 35–40% of all the water melting in the glaciers. And if we can somehow keep temperatures to 2 degrees, which is the Kyoto Protocol sort of ambition, you're looking at about 65–70% of all water being lost in the glaciers. The bad news is that with the Manu Lao Observatory recording 420 parts per million of carbon concentration in the atmosphere for the first time 2 weeks ago, we have locked in enough carbon in the atmosphere right now to reach 2 degrees centigrade by the middle of next decade. Easily. Which means, you know, frankly, by the end of this century, it's not just the water that's going to run out. The people of the Hindu Kush, Karakoram, and Himalayan mountain ranges, their life, their culture, their civilization is going to be wiped out. This was the bad news that Ghulam Rasool told me in a presentation in November 2018. Around about the first time I ever heard of this wonderful young girl called Greta Thunberg, who was taking time off school to protest her government's inactivity on climate change. And there I am in Islamabad listening to Ghulam Rasool basically tell me that the world in Pakistan is coming to an end, and our grand plan right now with the HKH glaciers is to put a road through it to China and put diesel trucks on it. And I'm wondering, why aren't kids in our part of the world taking time off school and protesting? Because this is ludicrous. There is a disconnect. So, you know, a week later, I give this talk to the Senate Standing Committee, and I'm talking about how Pakistan's response to climate change isn't enough. Whatever it is we're doing, it isn't enough, was the summary of my talk. And I get back to Lahore, and I get a call from the Director General of the Climate Division of the Ministry of Climate Change. Wonderful fellow. Calls me up and says, you know, Rafay, I was there listening to you. And I have to say, Pakistan complies with all of its obligations under the Paris Agreement. And we are doing this. And, you know, we're not a big greenhouse gas emitter. So we're not guilty of the climate crimes that you're sort of speaking about. Pakistan is complying with its climate commitments. This sent me on a spiral because, first of all, we don't have kids protesting on the streets, and our government is telling us that everything is fine and, you know, we're complying with our obligations under the climate agreements. This is a disconnect. This is a massive disconnect. So it sent me into a spiral, and I started looking up stuff about, you know, why is it that Pakistan and other developing countries take this position where we are not massive climate greenhouse gas emitters. It's the West and the global North that has done the historical greenhouse gas emissions. And therefore, global equity requires them to compensate us so that we can do the right thing, which is the text that Brazil, India, to some extent China, and certainly Pakistan are taking when it comes to the discussion on climate change and adaptation and mitigation. So I went into this spiral and I started looking into this thing. And it occurred to me, especially with the carbon concentration that's going on, we're talking about 420 parts per million, do understand that when the first UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was executed in 1992, the carbon concentration in the atmosphere was about 350 parts per million. It was never supposed to go over 400. The point of the UNFCCC was to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions. So the idea was from 350, we'd sort of peak at 380, 375 or something like that. We haven't done that. We've shot through 400. We've shot through 420. And so at this point, you have to ask yourself, are the assumptions made in 1992 about global climate change and the responsibility of countries still valid 27 years later? And the answer is no, it isn't. And this is very important because back in 1992, when we signed, the entire world, it was the largest collection of countries in the world that had signed on to a document, the Rio Declaration. In 1992, when we signed on to that, there was this idea that the global North had polluted more and the global South had polluted less, and therefore there was this historical inequity that had to be somehow countered through this principle of common but differentiated responsibility. It's the heart of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and it distinguishes countries between developed and non-developed, where developed countries are supposed to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and developing countries are supposed to adapt to them. And it's this legal framework, that assumption, based on that assumption, countries are supposed to reduce and stabilize greenhouse gas emissions based on the common and differentiated responsibility. And it's based on that legal principle that countries like Pakistan can take a step back and say, look, we are not major greenhouse gas polluters. Therefore, we don't need to do the things that other countries like the European Union or the United States or Canada needs to do. This is incorrect. It's deeply incorrect, because the common but differentiated responsibility principle of 1992 assumes we're going to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions. The truth is that since 1992, we have emitted more greenhouse gases than we ever did as civilization before 1992. There's been no stabilization of greenhouse gases under the international agreements. And so this idea that different countries owe different responsibilities doesn't hold truth anymore. We are in serious, serious problems. And this is what I'm coming to. We're in serious problems. And every country has to take its whatever it can do to be able to stand to the sort of challenge of the climate crisis. And Pakistan is very much part of that. You'd mentioned we're the fifth largest country in the world, fifth largest by terms of population, one of the most vulnerable to climate change, and yet somehow removed from the international debate on climate change. President Joe Biden recently announced a climate summit of 40 of the most vulnerable countries on earth, excluding Pakistan for the first couple of weeks, but I read just a few days ago that Pakistan's back on the list. That sort of exclusion of countries like Pakistan that are going through an existential sort of understanding of what the climate crisis means is deeply worrying, deeply, deeply worrying. This is everyone's problem. And the climate crisis requires countries like Pakistan not to stand behind legal lacuna that allow it to continue to pollute and emit greenhouse gases, like countries like Brazil and China as well. This is everyone's responsibility, especially when renewable electricity tariffs are so much cheaper than they are compared to fossil fuel tariffs. I want to stop there because I'm sort of talking about climate change, and I maybe in the questions and answers specifically hone in on issues in Pakistan. If that's okay, Maira, back to you.
That sounds good. I think that's a great way to start. Thank you for those comments, Rafay. Mubbashir, can I invite you now to speak to us?
The classic Zoom problem of muting yourself. Can you hear me? Okay. I have my headphones, so just why I was testing again. Thank you for this invitation. And I was struck by the land acknowledgement that we started with. And I was thinking how we would do that in Pakistan. How do we think about the rights of people who are make their livelihood? Can we use the word indigenous in lands where people have been pastoral, nomadic, but definitely have lived off the land, of the resources? And to me, environmental justice gets at the heart of that question. And perhaps I'm coming in as a cultural anthropologist, so it was fantastic to hear kind of a big picture from Rafay about the environmental kind of the place of Pakistan in the international community when it comes to the conversation around the future of our planet, especially with such a big portion of the population of the world in such a critical geography as well. But I would like to go from my expertise, which is to look at things from the ground up. And for me, environmental justice is a simple question, even though it's an abstract term, but it's about how our shared resources are unevenly shared. So if you think about the Commonwealth in terms of water, land, air, it becomes scarce when it's commodified. It becomes scarce when people are dispossessed and evicted. So environmental justice gets at the environment in a very different way and perhaps you can call it political ecology, perhaps you can call it different things, but for me, the central question always remains is to question the idea of the environment as a whole, because the environment is an abstraction. People talk about environment as if they can conserve it, they can exploit it, they can protect it, they can on and on and on. What that does is creates a kind of very distant perspective. And there's a whole scholarship on this in the American West and William Cronin, but I'm trying to think through Pakistan. So we tend to think about the environment in a very awkward ways because indigeneity, being off the land, being a nomadic pastoral person is a sign of primitivism or anxieties about development or not. So if you are person who works and their life is defined by sustainable or livelihood based on nature, it's a source of anxiety for middle classes and for the nation state. So that's the beginning of the environmental justice conversation for me, at least. And it takes us to the very highly visible questions of environmental justice that you outline, Maira, really well, that get a lot of attention, like demolition of course, mass housing of the poor, informal housing, the Ravi Canal projects. But this question also pertains to hundreds of thousands and thousands, if not millions of acres of land that are going into extraction of coal in Tharparkar that doesn't get that much visibility. Or the massive solar plants, if you want to call it farms, that are being set up in central Cholistan, right? And what that is doing, and I use these two examples partly in my conversation with friends who are activists to highlight these questions, but also to look at the two polar opposites of how land is becoming. Okay, let me backtrack. So I was talking about indigeneity and modes of livelihood. To reframe environmental justice, not looking at environment as an abstraction, but look at how the environment is in historically specific ways in which places where people inhabit and make use of the land to make a livelihood, live off water resources. So that is, of course, the classic image which works very well with the nation state. The building block is the peasant. But there's also the pastoral communities, the nomadic communities, the fisher folks, the grazing communities. So the topography, geography of Pakistan and its political ecology has vast variety and diversity of modes of livelihood. And in that, we think about environmental justice as a way in how do these communities get to have access to shared resources, or how much of they are deprived of them as the abstractions of the market or conservation even, or even solar energy are being deployed in certain specific ways that could lead to land grabs. So solar is one, coal plants is the other. With coal plants, there's this obsession that we have in Pakistan with infrastructure, that the infrastructure will make us into Dubai, or the infrastructure projects will have this magical potential to transform. And you talked about dams, and our dams are our iconic infrastructure, but Gwadar is also there, as are many, many other infrastructure projects like canal irrigations. We've talked about this in many ways. So now one belt and one road, and we have, in order to fuel that, in order to make that happen, we have mass amounts of dirty coal extraction going on in Tharparkar, in Mitti. A very, very, how can I say, vulnerable landscape as well, even though it's not So you guys are the experts in water. I'm obsessing with land, right? So that's why I let you guys have the water part. And in that capacity, if you think about the fact that, just the scale, and this is from Alliance for Climate Justice, which is a coalition between Pakistan Fisher Folks, Alternative Law Center, RDPI, and they have done some environmental assessments of the Thal Coalfield Block 1. I'll just talk about that, not Block 2. We're talking about 13,650 acres of land that's being used. That's just one part of the larger project. The cost of this project to extract coal is $3.2 billion. 75% financing is from the Chinese finance, and 25%, I won't be able to tell you exactly the SEPCO. So in that capacity, we are investing in a source of energy that is going to be, it's a fossil-based energy source that is going to destroy the landscape in that area, and you're going to import lots and lots of very precious water, because mining requires water. So in Tharparkar, which is already water scarce, you are even taking away water from people to mine coal. And that coal is going to be burnt to create infrastructure, which is promising a utopian future. But at the same time, if you look at the legacy of infrastructure in Pakistan, just look at Balochistan, it doesn't connect. It actually polarizes, because it's being instituted in places which are, infrastructure itself does not make anything. It does what, I don't want to get into infrastructure studies right now, but all I'm trying to say is there's no guarantee if the train line is going to distribute food, or is going to take grains and food away from peasants to elsewhere where people can pay. And so if you're living in a highly unequal and racially or ethnically stratified society, the people who will be benefiting for new roads, new cities, new infrastructural forms are going to be the privileged. And the people who are of this region will be evicted and dispossessed. And if you can't make a living by the modes of livelihood that you have been working on subsistence, you will turn to the cities. And our upper middle classes have very Malthusian obsessions about poor people breeding too much, but I'm sorry to say, it's all, people don't think about all the dispossession that's happening because of the projects they're investing in all over Pakistan. Okay, so I can go on. I actually didn't think I had much to say, but I'm sorry I'm going on and on. But one of the major things that I really wanted to emphasize is as activists of environment in Pakistan, we need to think about environmentalism not as exchange value, not as an abstraction, not only through conservation, but through political ecology, to look at from the ground up, from the risks that are unevenly distributed, as well as how our shared resources are unevenly distributed in that sense. So that to me is environmental justice. Just because I talked about coal, let me flip, and just to show how there's no guarantee, solar is seen for many people as the panacea, just like conservation sounds like a great thing. But like I'm saying, if you're looking at it from an abstract exchange value, a distant perspective, then the deployment of solar farms can also be a massive mode of eviction for people who are going, and also a land grab. Because a lot of the regions in where solar panels are being established, and this is by another organization called RUK or Rakuk, and they have been working with communities around the Chobara solar plant. It's in Cholistan. Again, this is not my primary research, but I'm just talking to activists and just paying attention to what's happening. And it's, so you have mass acreage of land that's been leased for 25 years to Zenfa, Chinese, it sounds like a, anyway, corporation, to create sustainable energy. But the idea of working off solar farms on a grid rather than breaking the grid and distributing solar to small villages and distributing solar to water pipes or tube wells or is a very different model of solar. So a concentrated model of solar farms actually can result in loss of millions of acres of grazing lands. And the last point I want to say is that there's never been a concerted effort to actually meet people where they're at and do livestock extension for grazing communities, for pastoral communities, if you're not tied to land and a certain forms of commercial agriculture, you are seen as a primitive person and you need to transform yourself. And so our job in Pakistani environmental activism is to rethink what we think about environmental justice from the ground up. And I think one of the major elements is to actually listen and work with communities about their ideas of land, nature, the kind of land acknowledgement we have just mentioned, which is, we often talk about communities, especially in the settler colonial context, that seem to be removed from the land. I know they're very much present, but the modes of living. But in Pakistan, when you have what we can call, for a lack of better word, indigenous modes of living, there is a need, I think, to actually listen carefully to find more creative alternative solutions through which we can actually build a more sustainable, a more just, a more distributive economy. And I think I've been talking too much, so I'll just stop.
Thank you, Mubbashir, for sharing those insights and also ongoing and more recent work. I do have responses / questions for both of you. But before that, I wanted to ask if Rafay, you had something to say to Mubbashir at this point, or if Mubbashir, you have a question for Rafay. At least I'm providing an opportunity so that it doesn't look like I'm dominating the conversation.
I don't have any questions, but Mubbashir did talk a couple of times about energy and coal and Tharparkar. And I wanted to speak about that. Thar coal is a proper conundrum. We're talking about Pakistan that has an energy crisis. And we know that energy per capita, if you increase energy per capita, you're increasing or diversifying human activity. And it is one of the great indicators of development as well. So the access to energy in Sindh is one of the promises of development in the region. At least that's what we're told. But Tharparkar, where there are immense amounts, apparently, of coal, is also one of the poorest districts in Pakistan. So it's an ironical situation where one of the great potentials of development is actually in one of the poorest parts of Pakistan. It is the poorest district of Pakistan. It's also the only district in Pakistan where there is a Hindu majority in terms of population. And so in this district, we have now massive investments in coal power, which are causing displacements of populations because of land acquisition, and will subsequently affect water issues because of the sort of extraction of coal for energy. This is massively problematic because, you know, these two promises themselves are in conflict with one another. At one point you have the promise of great electricity. The other hand, you have sort of the protection of indigenous rights and so on. And this is, in many ways, one of the great battlefields of environment justice in Pakistan. I'll certainly agree to that. I have no answers to the problems of what's happening in Tharparkar, but I think this is one of the sort of issues that people around the world need to understand, is focal to the entire principle that we're trying to understand of climate and environment justice. There are other issues in Pakistan as well, which, for example, Mubbashir spoke about the Ravi development in Lahore, which is Lahore is, a city of nearly 1,000 years, if not more, a city of nearly 10 million people next to a river, the Ravi River, where there is now, with this new government, the promise of developing about 40 kilometers of the reach of the river Ravi into a new city, a reach that has previously been used for agriculture. And there are tens of thousands of people right now whose land and livelihoods are now under threat because of this urban development project that the government is now introducing. That again is a great conflict of environment justice, because there's one promise of developing Lahore into a modern sort of city, along with this new infrastructure along the city, along the river, and at the same time you have tens of thousands of people who for generations have conducted agriculture along the land, which is now under threat of urban development. And there are massive questions of whether such a development is in the public purpose, whether it's in the public interest, whether even urban development in these circumstances is probable or good. I think that's a great battle as well. And I want to also then mention a third, you could say, front of climate justice, which is incidentally in Pakistan on cotton. BT cotton is a genetically modified form of cotton which is used in Pakistan. Nearly 90%, if not more, of the cotton in Pakistan that's now sown is BT cotton. It's a genetically modified cotton that has the BT, you could say, BT, I don't know what the phrase is, but it's a toxin that inhabits the seed and prohibits bollworms from actually eating into it. Cotton is a massive, huge export crop in Pakistan. We produce about 10 to 12 million barrels or million bales of cotton every single year. And to each million bales of cotton, there is approximately $1 billion of export potential as well. So if we produce 10 million bales of cotton, there's $10 billion worth of export that comes into Pakistan. This seed, by the way, is a huge battlefront, because as this seed propagates, and as I said, 90% of Pakistan is under a cultivation of BT cotton, Pakistan and India historically are the place of Indian cotton. It's the source and origin of one of the oldest varieties of cotton, along with Egyptian cotton, is Indian cotton. The muslin that we hear about in novels from prehistory in South Asia, or all this example of indigenous cotton, which is being replaced now by BT cotton, because Pakistan now exports cotton to various multinationals like Levi's and so on and so forth. This is a huge battleground that people don't really talk about, because it touches upon not food security, but something. But food security is farmers and food. But what about farmers who are planting non-food varieties, cash crops like cotton? That's where BT cotton plays out. And this is very, very important, because as the West's sort of demand for these consumables like cotton increases, Pakistani farmers' ability and rights to be able to cultivate what they can on their own property is being diminished at the same time. So it's not just about land rights. Mubbashir has talked about the Okara farmers, one of the great cases of environmental justice in the world. But at the same time, what about what the farmers are planting? So there are several fronts of environmental justice. You've got the BT cotton front, you've got the Ravi front, you've got the Thar coal front. And these are discussions that I think in many ways aren't coming up in the larger discourse of environmental rights in the world. I've had the great privilege of being able to travel on issues like climate change in Pakistan and air pollution in India and Pakistan. And when I do travel on these issues, I'm struck again and again about how Pakistan this country of 200 million people, one of the most vulnerable countries in the world when it comes to climate change, one of the great battlefronts when it comes to environmental justice and these issues, how Pakistan is not part of the debate when it comes to global climate issues, global environmental issues. I fail to understand why this is. You'll have, I'm not diminishing other issues on environmental rights around the world, like in India and in China and Africa, but I'm just surprised with such clear-cut divisions and fronts on these issues that Pakistan isn't part of a global debate or a larger global debate.
I mean, I think we might be traveling in different circles because I think Pakistan is, of course, on the margins, but if you look at the Kisan movement in India, if you look at the question of agriculture and BT cotton, and I think one of the things in Pakistan, in order to articulate and amplify livelihood struggles or environmental justice issues, you have to have a society where you don't get picked up for talking out in public. You don't get called a terrorist and arrested. So I think our struggles of just dealing with slow violence, as Maira said it, are offset by the spectacles of violence that are happening all the time, right? So I think, people talk about economic development and all, but just like the very right to live and breathe and ask for clean water could be a dangerous thing to do in parts. And I don't want to make it exceptional in Pakistan. It's true for much of the post-colonial world or under war and terror, because it has allowed the army, it has allowed a militarization, securitization, and if that logic of securitization goes to apply to imposition of a coal plant, then if you're fighting against a coal plant, then you're a terrorist. If I don't agree with the argument that this coal is necessary for development of Tharparkar, or it's going to benefit vast majority of the people of Sindh, and it's actually going to have a much more destructive element for the immediate area, but perhaps even in the long term, the entire region. That's not the way to go, but that could be done in many parts, and it could be done in Pakistan maybe 10 years ago, but today, in front of us, CPEC style infrastructure project, you're gone. So I think there's many, many reasons, and I think we have to think about environment along and entangled with that. And I think that the kind of conversations that are happening in certain circles about framing targets and degrees of temperature, I take the Rob Nixon approach, where environmental discourse or environmentalism has always been there. People just were they were blind to it, because for people, they needed to find clean, potable form of water to drink. And that was their struggle. So I think, it becomes, again, an abstraction at a certain moment when the UN climate comes up with certain kind of figures, when we speak on behalf of the nation state without really even knowing the caste politics in Tharparkar. They're Hindus, yes, but within that, there's so much going on in those communities where you might have the hierarchy of the, Brahmin communities aligned with these projects, where the most marginalized folks, I don't want to use the word Dalit in this context, but, will be the Kolis or others. If you're working with them, so in order to really make a difference, we actually have to know these communities. We have to spend time there and understand their ways of thinking about land, water, and building from that ground up. Otherwise, we have had disastrous mining projects happening all over the world that haven't been very helpful for the vast, South Africa, certainly, in mining, Bolivia in different ways, for lithium now, coups, United States itself, look at Appalachia, right? So in terms of environmental justice, we need to really think about the politics and by not big P politics, but the ground up livelihood politics, and as they get organized. So it's not about just land. Land is central because it's the basis on which a lot of people, it's also about ability to move across land as well for people, right? So what I will urge is that looking at environment, not as an abstraction, but to look at the struggles of subsistence in sustainable ways. That would be a kind of discourse of environmental justice that I think we could build off of. And there's potentials for coalitions. I'm thinking of the reason why it becomes very difficult for people in Gwadar to have I'm not a nationalist. I'm not that invested in, like preserving the nation state or our place in a different conference table. I don't really care. But in terms of within the country, I think there's a class struggle. And I think if there is unity and there's solidarity and strength in numbers, but those kinds of issues never quite emerge. Roti kapda makan, basic food, water, and it's, that could be a building block, and it means different things for some people. They earn their bread, they earn their roti by not just farming cotton, which is a big, of course, important commercial crop. And I'm not saying this, but also think about the people who are hawking recycled yellow pages and IKEA catalogs, and and then also their cousins are back cutting mooli or whatever, so radishes for snacks or whatever. So there's an informal economy. Then again, there's another, I just stuck my examples to the rural context because often the river Ravi project or and they don't get enough attention, but at least there is a little bit of dawn news coverage, whereas a lot of what's happening in this vast country of ours remains invisible. And personally, I should say that I haven't been to these sites where this is happening, but because I take interest, I know they're activists, so there are ways of showing solidarity and reaching out, and it's possible to just do enough research and you can find people in those areas to work with. So sorry, but I think Maira, you were supposed to ask us questions too. I
wanted to make on this question of what sorts of efforts or struggles are registering on the national consciousness. I think it's a key question, and I'm sort of always struck by how Pakistanis, a lot of Punjabis, let's say, want to or go to Atabad for vacation, and very few people know about the politics around that, right? Do they know of the kind of struggle for climate justice that people like Baba Jan have had started, how that process unfolded? So yes, there is I think that there is a privileging of certain sites, not surprisingly, right? Like big metropolitan Lahore, and so projects around it will jump to wider media attention in a way that peripheral areas, or those that are thought to be peripheral, will not. My one question I have is, it springs from Mubbashir, when you were talking about livelihood politics, and it's specifically about the Ravi project. And so it's also a question to Rafay. It's, I think partly, yes, it speaks to this class divide, to the multiple class divides. So in the conversations that I have been having with some people around the Ravi project, so for those who don't know about the Ravi project, it's this massive development project to create, to develop the Ravi riverfront, to make a new Dubai, to make a new Lahore, to make a new city. It promises to channel the Ravi, to turn it from a sludge carrier into, into a revitalized river. It also promises flood control. And of course, here the backdrop is India wants to flood us. So these much older narratives have fed into the project. One of the tensions here has been, based on the little work that I have done around the project is people will say, or people are seeing, that those whose lands are going to be affected by the project, those whose lands have come within the project, the narrative goes, oh, they don't really have environmental concerns. There's not enough environmental consciousness. They just want the right price for their land. For them, it's a compensation issue. It's not an environmental issue. And it also makes me think of what you said, Mubbashir, earlier about, ways of relating to land. And so I wonder within this space of environmental politics, as we try to work around these axes of differentiation, if we want to seriously do the work of coalition building, what would a way forward be from this reality? Compensation matters. It matters the price that your land will get for coming under a project. So how then can this inform understandings of the environment? Because there does seem to be an abstract environmentalism at play here. Oh, the land, the price of land, you're dirtying our conception of the environment. You shouldn't really worry about it. Of course, that's spoken from a position of immense privilege. And so, Rafay, I ask you because I know that you are intimately involved with the project and what's happening around it. And Mubbashir, I ask you because you are a scholar of, among other things, land. And I'm wondering if you have seen this before or in other places also, where this question of, oh, people care about the price of land, it kind of dirties the environmental politics space.
Maira, I'm going to jump right in before Mubbashir has a chance to answer and say that actually I'm counsel in a couple of cases challenging the Ravi project. We're in the High Court, and there are what we call in Pakistan stay orders or interim injunctions, or I believe the United States, there's a motion, that's the legal phrase, that restricts any development on the Ravi project. So we've got them slowed down. A couple of weeks ago, I went to a protest that had been organized by the Hukuk-e-Khalq movement, which is this fantastic, I don't know the other way to say, but socialist political movement among students in Pakistan. I went to a protest that they'd organized. And I met a bunch of people. Amar Jan, you might have heard of him, a symbol of troubles, or what is it? Seditionist. You can't be seen in public with him. He introduced me to a bunch of young men whose lands or whose parents' lands were going to be affected by this Ravi project, in which I'm a lawyer, in which I've filed cases, in which I've stopped the development. And these young men said to me that their properties were actually very close to the river Ravi and subject to the alluvion and diluvian of the shifting of the riverbanks, and that the project itself would solidify the banks and protect their property. And so there I was, somebody who's stopping the potential benefit of their land because of some abstract sort of public interest that Lahore shouldn't grow in a particular way. It did strike me as a bit of a conundrum there. The Ravi project, on the other hand, it raises many issues. You'd spoken about the water, for example. The river Ravi that passes through Lahore, the waters of the Ravi were allocated to India under the Indus Water Treaty, which means that as a result of infrastructure development until 2010 and subsequently in India, the water of the Ravi no longer flows into Pakistan, which means the riverbed is actually dry. And what we have then is a government project that is seeking to promote real estate development on the banks of an empty river next to a city of 10 million people, which actually doesn't have a single waste treatment plant. This itself is the problem with the river Ravi. But at the same time, you have people who have interests, propertied interests in the development of their area, which is in conflict with the types of principles that I'm talking about. It's a proper conundrum, but I have my clients and I have to face the courts that are going forward. I'd like to speak more about this if you have any more questions specifically about the Ravi, but I want to listen to what Mubbashir has to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is particular, since I don't know too much about the specifics, but to speak from the general point of view, this is a pattern that's intensifies in Pakistan because of the extreme disparities in terms of how that is the only mode of speculation that is a guaranteed profit in Pakistan. And where do you put your money, you know, in terms of stock markets and whatever. So land is more than land. It's actually, you know, I don't have to say this, obviously, it's a hyper commodity. But this mode of commodification of land is not something that's natural either. You know, it didn't always exist in the same intense, accelerated way. And for me, it would be interesting to look at what are the driving, I mean, right now it's a big question, how does one do that? But part of the environmental politics is to really rethink about what is private property, right? And what is collective property, and how to think about rights in ways that is not exclusive. And so this, you know, when I start talking like this, I'm very aware that I might be like, start moving in this very out there way of thinking. So you have to be practical in terms of what Rafay is doing and many other activists are doing it strategically. But I think in a broad sense, we also have to think about what kind of investments and divestments are being made to make the land valuable as it is. A lot of public resource budget allocations, road building has to be produced, electricity has to be guaranteed, water has to be provided to make a plot of land valuable, and a lot of policing has to be allocated. So there's a lot of infrastructure that goes into making land into a commodifiable land. So I think that has a question of the state and its participation with developers, Bahria Town, of course, Malik Riaz, and many others. But then the military itself is a real estate developer. So there is this question that we are left with is, where is the state, where is the public interest, where is the public good, right? And especially when you look at in the largest sense of the word, 40 or 60% of the population of Karachi is living in informal housing, right? So even though in our little bubbles we say it's the universe and everyone is, whoever has a little extra surplus is trying to invest it, but it's a smaller section of the society. I mean, there is obviously flats in Karachi, and there's shops, and you know, the worth of land in inner city Lahore is also very inflated in conjunction to the speculation and where that's happening. So I think the market and land and how it emerged in a way, we need a serious study of that, and how can we find, where does it even start regulation? You know, how does, you know, my father and my family, like we were like, you know, they were Muhajirs, they came from India. I don't know where they found a place, but I know that, you know, they started with quarters that were built in the Ayub Khan's, you know, Korangi Road projects. And, you know, at that time, there was a certain kind of mobility where I mean, I'm sure there's class mobility all the time, but like for people who are not hustling big time, people who are like teachers, that they were able to get to Federal B area and Azimabad, Gulshan Iqbal, you know, that's the trajectory that happened. I wonder like how possible it is for people who have clerk-like jobs to have that level of mobility anymore in Pakistan, right? So, and how much of that should be a priority? Is that even a conversation anymore, you know? Because even the stability of a job is not, I mean, so anyway, so I think it's land is tied to a larger model of the economy that we are living with. And that model is extremely neoliberal and hyper something else beyond neoliberal. I mean, I don't know what to call it, because you also have entities that don't have to work around the logic of the marketplace because they have guns. So I guess that's that. I mean, I think, yes, you're right about this question of compensation, but we have to think about the conditions of possibility that put people in those positions to have those options as the only options for them, as opposed to, because if you sell your land, some big person comes in, buys it, makes a big plot, where do you take your surplus? Where do you go? Where's the next Abadi? In Karachi, people have been going towards Hyderabad, moving further and further and further. And that also has ecological impacts in the city in terms of where does the water go. I'm not just talking about Bahria town, I'm talking about more modest suburbs. So I know Karachi a little bit more, but question of real estate and land is central to rethinking environmental justice in Pakistan.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, thank you. There's a question, so I'm going to ask you that question. Both of you should feel free to address it, and I'm going to add to it my own question, which I think is kind of linked. So the question is, in relation to some of the cases that Mubbashir and Rafay have spoken about. So for example, we spoke about, Tharparkar coal, and we spoke about the Ravi project and the others. How are these related to projects such as afforestation projects, the billion tree tsunami, for instance? And the part that I want to add to the question is, I think something that I am trying to make sense of with also my opening comments, where you have the court saying, global climate change is happening. This is a new reality. It's not really about who's to blame, but we're all in this together. And then you have courts also saying, hey, we have to build these big dams, which will displace thousands of people and be very destructive ecologically, but that's the way to deal with climate politics. So how does one make sense of the state, given that there are all these very contradictory manifestations, right? You have one Chief Justice who says we need an entirely new conception of water justice, not just climate justice. And then you have another one who says, hey, we have to build dams exactly like we built or we did the 1965 war.
Can I jump in and answer there? There is, I don't mean to generalize, but I'm going to. I sometimes say that in Pakistan, everyone's an expert and everyone is a doctor. You get sick anywhere in Pakistan and some uncle or auntie will step up and say, why don't you do this? Because, we're all doctors and we're all experts as well, because we'll jump in and say, we have a water issue, build a dam. What does someone in Lahore know about the topography of the northern regions and, of course, the water availability in Pakistan to suggest something as ludicrous as a dam? But, we're experts and we're all doctors. Where does this come from? It comes from a concern for water. And this is where our judiciary and this is where a lot of politics on environment seem to get haywired. We have a judiciary that seems to think that hydropower is the solution to our problems. A mental framework that's rooted in the 1960s. There are reasons for that, but it's very interesting to see it happen. And then the other thing we have, which is close to the parable I'm giving you that we're all experts and we're all doctors, is that our knee-jerk reaction to environmental issues in Pakistan appears to be plant trees. Build a road, it's going to cause an environmental issue, plant trees. You want to build a coal-fired power plant that's going to do X, Y, Z to the environment, plant trees. Planting trees, in our expert opinion as doctors of the environment, seems to be the panacea of it all. And here comes this billion tree tsunami, which was the provincial government of KP's initiative between the 2013 and 2018 election period. And the same political party, the PTI, has now attained majority in the federation and now runs the government of Pakistan. And it seems that, therefore, billion tree tsunami, it's quite interesting. The PTI is the first political party that I can think of in Pakistan that has used a green project for lobbying and rallying for an election. For a general election in Pakistan, the PTI used tree plantations as an example of what it can do in terms of delivering for the entire country, and it votes, right? So in many ways, this knee-jerk ability of ours to be doctors and experts and plant trees in response to any initiative as a sort of panacea to environmental issues has become a political issue, or an issue that a government in Pakistan is now talking about. This is not just great news, but it's horrific news at the same time. It's great news because, oh my God, environmental issues are now being mainstream politically sort of considered. You know what happens when environmental issues become part of mainstream political discourse? If I talk about how, for instance, that nowhere in the world do trees actually grow in a straight line, when I talk about how monoculture in tree plantation is not good for ecosystems, I am criticizing a government's political initiative that's related to the environment, and I become a political opponent of a government that is now in majority in the federation. So the bad news, it seems, in Pakistan for environmental issues becoming mainstream is that when you start critiquing them, you become a political opponent. Right? For something as innocuous as trees. Forests are a part of human culture going through civilizational history. Forests in Pakistan seem to be the solution that this political party and government are providing as an answer to our environmental issues. As if planting trees is somehow going to improve the air quality. As if planting trees will provide equitable distribution of drinking water. Those things aren't going to happen with planting trees. Trees are beautiful. They're fantastic. You know, they provide shade. They change color during the seasons. But they're not going to be the answer to the climate problem and climate issue. In fact, and this is what I keep on telling people, that even with 10 billion trees planted, about 200-300 years from now, when we finally, when the human civilization writes its final missive to the world, once it collapses because of the climate crisis, there'll be a small footnote towards the last chapter saying there was a small country called Pakistan that made a Hail Mary pass to try and absorb carbon through an afforestation project. I think that's wonderful. I think that's a great idea, but it's not the solution to the climate issue. And we now have a government that is using this afforestation project to you could say, divert criticism on any sort of proper critique of its abilities to provide and deliver on climate issues or even environmental issues. You to critique the PTI government on any environmental issue, they turn around and say, we're planting trees. This is an unfortunate sort of byproduct of environment becoming more political, and an interesting sort of development in Pakistan.
Yeah, I mean, I can't add too much to that. I think I started with this idea. It's always dangerous when environment is seen as a thing, as a spectacle. And so there can be a bigger spectacle than a billion tree afforestation project, or, you know, so with that comes, going back to the question of land, it's also a land grab in parts of the country where contractors can use that to, you know, in Parachinar and other parts of the KP, it's happening for many years now. So it also becomes, you know, conservation, all these wonderful things like solar panels, that's why I talked about that, farms, can be dangerous if they are not understood through local ecologies, relationships, and understood in the kind of political context. I think we definitely need to, I just was also amused because I was remembering, you know, the Brilliant Tree tsunami thing kind of happened more recently, but I remember the palm tree episodes, and we, like, Pakistan has this obsession with trees, and then, you know, anxieties around the neem tree. So I think there is something about trees and nationalism in Pakistan that has a long history, and that is something that we have to look at. Like, we are very uncomfortable with Hindu trees, but we like, you know, so-called, you know, that's what I'm trying to say, that there is a, but there's also this beautiful element of indigenous, sorry.
That idea of trees and nationalism do you know that the eucalyptus, which is roundly criticized as being a water extractor, as if it's the country of India stealing water from Pakistan, it's only a tree. There's an article in the Dawn day before yesterday that talks about the introduction of the eucalyptus during the Ayub Khan, specifically Ayub Khan era, and part of the sort of, you know, idea of having these martial regimes in democracies that actually affect environments. Yeah, so trees and nationalism. It was old Ayub Khan that brought the eucalyptus and this idea of plantation to Pakistan. That was a byproduct of the canal development of the Indus Water Treaty and how it affected groundwater in Pakistan. So yeah, trees and nationalism do go together in Pakistan's sort of mental discourse.
So, you know, an artist, yeah, absolutely. And an artist could do a really wonderful thing with Ayub and eucalyptus and Ziaul Haq and palm trees, and, you know, like, all, I can only imagine this. I don't know what and Imran Khan with, I don't know what his favorite tree is right now, but there is a tree that goes with every, at least dictatorship, it seems to me. We'll have to find something for Musharraf. But I think he was invoking Ayub, so eucalyptus was big back then too, but I don't know. So I think, but I don't want to, I think just going back to that question, I think, again, there's a beautiful article by Michael Dove, who is a political environmental anthropologist, and he did some fieldwork in Pakistan, and he talked about the discourse around trees where people, it's not just about the shade, it's about tastes, you know, and how it's the sweetness of the shade, the bitterness of the shade of different trees. And we don't have the sensitivity, or we're not attuned to that because we have alienated understanding of tree. I'm not saying that we will all become trees or, you know, like connoisseurs, but that is a form of knowledge that could be appreciated and respected, but we have been very anxious around indigenous idea. I don't want to use that word, but there's certain kinds of trees that make us nervous because they are tied to our different types of paths, or there are certain kind of trees that maybe take up too much room, or they're too lucrative to chop up. But that's my favorite thing if I'm ever outside the city, because you don't see those kind of trees, is to just sit under them. You know, the board, different types of trees in the south. So that's something that I like to learn more about. And, you know, Rafay probably has it would be a great thing to talk about one day, about like trees and nationalism. I love that idea. And there's a lot of projects in there.
The thing with forests, I'm sorry, Maira, I'm jumping in. There is this concept of forests being nice places where we plant, where they're trees. But forests in India actually have a political and legal connotation. Forests in India are actually an extractive, the forest laws of colonial India, which still are applicable in Pakistan, are not places or not legal regimes where you're protecting the environment, you're actually exploiting resources. Forests are places where trees are grown so that they can be cut and used for back then for the railways that the British were developing in India. So when you declare any area a forest, you actually make it the property of the government, and you then exclude the rights of all the people who use that forest. Forests are for people and indigenous people of the forests and the areas around them not just places for energy, but places for food and also for their medicine. So this legal regime is extremely exclusionary, extremely exclusionary. And yet, because we have this billion tree tsunami and this massive discourse and this sort of urban idea that trees are wonderful, we tend to forget that whenever the government is planting trees, again in a straight line, it's doing something against not only nature, but also in an expropriatory way.
Okay, so time is up. And while I am very interested in a longer and deeper conversation on, for example, trees and nationalism, I think we'll have to set that for a later time. I want to thank both our guests, Mubbashir and Rafay, for joining us. If there are any questions that are unanswered, we'll also make sure to collect them and send them to you, but thank you for joining us. Good evening
so much
for you and good night for the other one.
Thank you all so much. Many thanks to Maira for moderating. Thank you. And I also want to thank Simrat Mataru for doing all behind the scenes work. It's fantastic. I'm just going to share my screen so we have a slide to end with some of our upcoming events, and everything you want to find out about the center is at southasia.stanford.edu.